Hi there. So this lecture is the addendum to the previous lecture that we discussed. Remember, the last lecture was about circular flow of goods and services, where we differentiated between markets for goods and services and markets for factors of production. And we said we dichotomized these two just like we dichotomized these two entities, which is firms and households. So the previous lecture was a basic explanation. Like we discussed, it's just a snapshot of the economy. So in this lecture we'll talk about circular flow diagram in a bit more detail. So these concepts are a bit advanced, I must say. So if you want, you can skip this lecture for a while and maybe return to these after you have listened to, let's say, couple of other lectures like demand and supply analysis, how banking system works, how the multiple creation of credit happens, how the production cycle works. That's those kind of lectures. Once you've listened to those, you can either visit this lecture or revisit this lecture. Anyway, the choice is yours. But like I said, it's just I'm discussing certain topics, certain terminology in this lecture will be a bit advanced. Alright, but you can understand it nevertheless. So let's talk about it. Let's get right to it. Markets for goods and services, markets for factors of production. Now the basic idea of an economy is not really the supply of goods and services. It's mostly consumption. Now why do I say that? The reason I say that is because if you remove every single parameter from the economy, consumption still remains. Okay, people must consume. As long as there is an economy, and we are assuming that economy is made of human beings, as long as there is an economy, you have to assume that they consume. So consumption is the underlying foundational principle to understand any facet of the economy. You have to understand that consumption pretty much is the foundational component. Alright, so the consumption happens in firms, it happens in terms of inputs for production, or like we said, factors of production. Okay, so it's not that only households consume, firms also consume. Just like households, firms consume. The category of consumption for firms is different than those for households. The category of consumption for firms is factors of production. Category of consumption for households is just simply labeled as consumption or spending. Okay, but that doesn't mean only households consume, firms consume as well. And we did talk about it that there isn't much difference between, if you really think about it, markets for goods and services and markets for factors of production. Both are actually markets. They're quite interchangeable also. We took a bunch of examples like sugarcane or a computer or a machinery that can be used for personal uses as well as used as a factor of production. Now if you look at this circular flow diagram, it all looks fine and dandy, but the only problem is that one component, one practical component is missing, and that component is that of finance. Okay, finance or financial institutions. Alright, something like banking. So that is missing from this conception. What we can also think of as credit giving institutions. Okay, so what is credit? Credit essentially means that certain resources are extended from one entity to another entity at a given cost, okay, and that resource is money in modern sense. You can think of it as some other resource other than money also. You don't have to only think of it in terms of money. It could also be some kind of factor of production. Okay, it could be some kind of factor of production. It doesn't have to be only money. Some kind of equipment can also be lent. The idea is that whenever a credit is extended, that means the payment is not immediate but delayed. And because of that delay in payment, something extra has to be given to the person or the entity which is extending the credit, or the person who is extending the credit. And this is an important concept, and it relates to a lot of things. It basically relates to the idea of interest rates. What does interest represent? And when we start talking about these things, things get excessively complex. But still, we will have to discuss them nevertheless. So, if we think about interest, okay, it represents something, some kind of value, because all money, okay, doesn't matter what, all money ultimately represents what? Some kind of value. I'm sorry about the handwriting, by the way, but as you know, I'm writing with a mouse pen, so these glitches are gonna happen. All money represents, I'll be a bit more careful now, all money represents value. Value meaning what? Okay, meaning some value representing some kind of utility. Utility that is derived from consumption of some kind. I know it's getting a bit abstract, but bear with me because these things will be clearer, okay, as we proceed. So one thing is for sure, that any kind of money represents value, some kind of utility that happens through consumption, because actually at a very abstract level all these things are interchangeable. So credit, which is extended either in form of money or in form of factors of production, okay, that anything extra that will be given for that delayed payment, that means if someone, let's take a simple practical example. You take a loan from the bank gives you money and they charge interest on it, okay. Why they charge interest on it? Because you don't have that money right now, you need it to buy something or to invest in something, and you can pay the bank later on, but that privilege that bank grants you, it charges something for it. Now I'm not saying whether those interest rates are justified or such and such interest rates are justified, should they be lower, should they be higher, should there be something like credit. I'm not getting into that kind of discussion. What I'm saying is that delayed payment extracts some kind of extra value, extra money is required to pay, and that in short can be called as interest, okay. Okay. Now interest also represents, that means interest essentially is what? It is in form of money, right? But we said that money represents value. But does that value exist right now? That's the question. Well, if you really think about it, that value doesn't really exist. The amount of interest that is charged on credit, that value doesn't exist as of now. That means if an investment gives you a rate of return, okay, capital I, I'm sorry, if an investment gives you a rate of return, it generally is written as ROR, of let's say 8%, and the interest applicable, if it is taken on the, well, we'll talk about that later, but just think about this. Just assume that interest is applicable, okay, and the interest applicable is, let's say, 5%. At a very fundamental level, at a very basic level, without getting into discounting and those compounding formula, even at a very superficial inspection, the actual rate of return will turn out to be 3%. Okay. So we cannot really say that rate of return was 8%, it is 3% actually. Okay, we are not applying any of the compound interest and discount formula here that are applied in finance. We're simply saying, and we'll talk about that, we'll talk about present value and future value in upcoming lectures, but right now let's think of it as a simple arithmetic. 8 minus 5, 3. The actual rate of return is only 3%. So that means interest is sort of eroding value in a way. Now, from a different perspective, let's think of it like this. If the market demands, let's say there is some kind of appliance, let's say there is a TV, okay. If the market demands $200, okay, for a TV, right? That's what market demands. You take a personal loan of 200, okay, you borrow this money. You borrow this money, but you're also paying some interest on it. So let's say from whoever you borrowed, you end up paying 230. Well, actually speaking, you end up in the current market, you end up paying actually 400 if you borrow for 200, given the rates of interest. If you compare it with, let's say, interest in United States, if you borrow it on a credit card, it comes out to be somewhere around, not 230 in fact, but it's an excessively obnoxious amount. But let's say, for the sake of convenience, that for a TV appliance you pay 200 for a TV which you borrow from a bank, okay, $200. You end up paying $230. So what is the price of TV that you bought? The price of TV is not 200 that is commanded by the market, but actually 230. Where does this 30 come from? What does this 30 represent? It represents something, right? So we have to assume that it represents this TV that you bought. But the market price is 200. Then what is this extra $30 for? And this is the dilemma of the interest rate. Think about it. This $30 is the vacuum that is created in the economy. It doesn't exist when you're buying TV, the equivalent value doesn't really exist in the market. And not only that, it assumes that equivalent amount of value will be created by you, so that not only you can pay 200 back plus some interest on it. That means you have to add value to this consumption appliance. And this is where it gets a bit crazy when it comes to the discussion on interest rates. Okay, so that's a problem. And we'll discuss more about interest rates and its validity because it's a much more abstract discussion. I don't want to have that discussion here, otherwise the lecture will become unnecessarily long. It doesn't remain a lecture anymore. It becomes a discussion. In fact, I mean, I keep calling it a lecture, but I suppose it's better. I'm always try to do this in the classes that I take, that it is a instead of a lecture, it's a discussion. But since it's a video, there's no back and forth going on. It's just me speaking, so might as well call it a lecture. So anyway, so in the beginning, what I was saying, okay, the component that is missing. This is just a a thought on what we mean by credit and why there is some kind of expectation of a surplus value that is created. The expectation of a surplus value that is created as soon as someone borrows something. Alright. So let's go back to the beginning. What we were saying, the component that is missing from this circular flow of diagram is the banking institution, or in short, we should, instead of just bank, a general term for financial institutions. Okay, that is missing from the circular flow, because if we discussed about this particular element, didn't we? We talked about, okay, what do we call as profit? Well, if the capital is lent as a factor of production. Well, if it is lent, then the interest will be charged on it, okay, or it will have some kind of rate of return on it. So it's not technically lent, it's invested. That is what profit really means, because interest essentially means it doesn't matter whether you have gains or losses. Interest is interest. It doesn't matter whether you have gains or losses, you have to pay it back. And that is why it gets crazier, because if an investment incurs a loss, then not only the expected value is not met, but in fact not only interest is not met, but even the expected value is not met, and not even the value that is demanded by the market is met. So it's a problematic scenario. Okay, so what is happening in the circular flow is a basic idea of the economy where it's assumed that everything that firms produce will be consumed in the markets for goods and services. That means there are no leakages. Okay, there are no leakages, meaning what? That means there is no surplus. There is no surplus production. That's assumed. Okay. In the markets of factors of production, everything that is offered in the market is produced, is consumed by the firms. That means even here there's no surplus. All the labor that is to be consumed, everyone who is in the job market, they find a job. All the land that is up for, let's say, used as a factor of production, it gets used. So sooner or later you have to come to the conclusion that it's sort of a fairy tale land that they're describing. Okay, but most of the models are like that. Most of the models are sort of fairy tales, but they give you the most superficial picture of how things will behave if everything else is constant, if everything else doesn't matter. That's the first idea of ceteris paribus. If we don't have that, it becomes maddening. Then you can't really comment on anything, believe me. So I understand why it is important, but you have to see through it. You have to understand that there is a component of wishful thinking in all these models. Okay, there is. And so it's not, you don't have to be a fanatic about economic theories, and that's why I'm not. I constantly tell people that you have to understand the ideas as they are expressed and see through them, see beyond them. You have to see the manufactured reality, and only then you can sort of dismantle what is wrong with it and come to much better practical conclusions about the economy, instead of sticking to the theories and paradigms and hypotheses. And this is true for all social science, really. Alright. So, what is assumed is there will be no leakage here, there will be no leakage here. There is no surplus. Alright, fine. But in the practical world, that happens all the time. Okay. What happens if there is a surplus? If there is a surplus, first of all, things will not be consumed, and in that case, firms will not make as much. In a very general sense, these things are called as inventories. Okay, you'll, in newspaper articles, you'll find this term. In any economic news, a newspaper or anything like that, you'll find this term, inventories. What is inventory? Inventory is just a surplus production. So if firms produce and there is a surplus, that means these goods and services are not sold completely. There is something left. Markets of goods and services are not able to buy whatever firms are producing completely. Alright, fine. So in that case, firms will not produce as much. That means the next time that they're going to produce, they'll not need as many inputs for production as before, right? The same thing can happen. What could be the causes of it? Well, the causes could be technology has improved. That means something that required such and such amount of factors of production, they don't require it anymore. So the technology has improved. Something happens. There could be a number of causes. So instead of what could be the cause, yeah, anything could be the cause. But one thing is for sure, if inventories accumulate, firms are not going to produce as much, inputs for production will not be consumed as much. That means the wages, rent or profit, whatever was earned by the households, got it? Whatever was earned in the form of income by whom? The households. That income will actually what? It will fall. The income will fall. They won't have as much income. If they don't have as much income on the aggregate, always remember all these things we are talking about aggregates. Okay, sum total. So the sum totality of consumers will not be able to spend as much as before. So what will happen if there is already a surplus in existence here? There is already a surplus in existence here, and households are not able to spend as much as before. That means what? This surplus will only grow. This surplus will grow. That means the firms will produce even less and less. Not only that, the revenue of the firms will also fall, because not as much as is being consumed. So the revenue will also fall. The revenue will fall. That means the rate of return that firms were expecting, that will also fall. So you see, with a slight something going wrong somewhere, and it doesn't really matter. We started with the firms, okay? You could have taken any starting point. You could have taken household. As your starting point instead of firms. If something goes wrong over there, let's say households are not consuming, or there is some kind of political turmoil, some natural calamity, anything, and households are not really willing to spend as much, then the same things will follow, the things that we just discussed. Let's say the availability of land and labor and capital, the prices for that, because of certain other reasons, the prices have increased and firms are not able to meet the pricing requirements for the markets or factors of production. The same things will follow. So it is fragile. This thing is extremely fragile and it's unreal. Okay. Having said that, now we're getting somewhere. Okay. So you understand the fragility of this, how sensitive this cycle is, and you basically understand that in reality it doesn't really exist like that. We already I've already realized that. Now coming back to the idea of financial institutions, okay, that is missing from this entire thing, because businesses generally rely on finance. Okay, they don't get investment, all of their investment at least, from households. A minor fraction, a percentage, is gotten from the households. Mostly they borrow that money, and when they borrow that money to start the production processes, we already saw there's a component of interest associated with it. That means whatever they are making, the cost of that whatever they are making is increased by the factor of the interest that they have to pay. Because the cost increases, the optimal amount of goods and services might not be manufactured or might not be sold in the markets for goods and services, because as soon as the cost increases, the price will also have to increase. Okay, as soon as the cost increases, the price will increase, and if the price increases, the quantity demanded actually falls, again leading to the problem of creation of surplus, either surplus goods or lower production. So this is just one of those ideas that one has to keep in mind when thinking about models in the economy. And not to make this lecture unnecessarily long, I have to sort of restrain myself here, but we'll revisit these topics and we'll keep on discussing about such things which are sort of peripheral to what is presented in the models directly. Yeah, so I hope it gave you some food of thought. It's not something that one understands immediately. One has to sort of contemplate about these things. So I hope I've given you something to think about. Not to take any of the economic models literally, and not to really think of them as as the end point of the discussion. That's where the discussion really begins, not doesn't end. Alright, so thank you. I'll post another lecture very soon, and it will be a regular kind of lecture. Okay, and I'll keep posting such addendums, sort of annexes to the theories and models discussed. Alright then, see you later.